early with coal mining, and the brothers, his sons tended to follow, a lot of them followed into various aspects of coal mining. So the family had a fair amount of wealth and position. Henry Howard Wiley was well educated. He had been given training as a draftsman and gone to a good academy. He had a really good education. And that's one characteristic that follows through with all of the children of this family. They all had really good educations. The problem is we don't know much about the education of the young women. All of the boys went to Baker Himmel School, which was Knoxville Prep School in the late 1800s. The young ladies probably went to the public schools in West Knoxville. To give a little more background, Catherine was the fourth of the 10 children of Edmund Floyd Wiley and Mary Catherine McAdoo Wiley. Edwin and 3 of his brothers fought in the Union Army with their father. When the Civil War started, they were living in Anderson County. They were all strong Unionists, but one of the sons joined the Confederate Army and was killed during the war. One of the sons who joined the Union Army was killed during the war. Henry Howard Wiley was an older man, but he volunteered and he served as a quartermaster in the Union Army. The sons were all officers. Catherine's father was promoted to captain, Company F in the 5th Infantry. So he was a 5th Cavalry. So he was he had a really important career during the war when he was a young man. It's interesting, and I don't have enough background to tell you, but he married the cultured young daughter of William Gibbs McAdoo Sr., who was very Confederate. And these families lived near each other for a time in Anderson County, but he married Mary Catherine McAdoo, and I think it was 1871, and it was in Georgia. The McAdoos were refugees in Georgia. Mary Catherine McAdoo was the daughter of William Gibbs McAdoo's first wife, the only child of the first marriage, and her mother was Anna Cleopatra Horsley. Anna was the oldest child, and she was very proud of her brother, William Gibbs McAdoo Jr. He's a very prominent career here in Knoxville, and later in politics. He was the Secretary of the Treasury for Woodrow Wilson, a member of the Wilson cabinet, and he married Woodrow Wilson's young daughter. He was in his 40s or maybe 50, and she was 21 or 2 or 3. President Wilson was not terribly pleased about this, but they had a White House wedding, a very small one, and Catherine got to attend the wedding. What I thought I'd do today is talk about something about the family and their oddly interconnected relationships, and use her scrapbook as a way to illustrate a little bit better some of her interests. And the one person that I knew in the family was Agnes. Agnes was the in-law of one of the young brothers, John Ernest Wiley, called Ernest by the family. And she was from Philadelphia. She came to Knoxville for the first time in 1926 to meet the family, and the family were not too thrilled that Ernest had married a Yankee. Not only was she a Yankee, but she was first-generation American. Her father was an English-born architect. I asked Agnes what she thought of Knoxville when she got here, and she said, well, I thought it was, she said, do you really want to know? I said, yes. She said, I thought it was a snooty little southern town, which amused me. But she was the one from whom I got most of what I know, and a lot of what I know is probably secondhand. If I could have had access to some of the older family, it would have been probably much better. But Agnes and Ernest were the 2 caretakers of Catherine during the years that she was in the mental hospital in Norristown, Pennsylvania. And the one letter I have that I was allowed to copy by a relative as it describes her outing with Agnes on Easter in 1946. And it's very touching. And Catherine wrote beautiful letters, and she tried to be very, very positive about her situation. But it must have been, her life must have been a little trial from 1927 till she died in the hospital in 1958. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Catherine's family lived in West Knoxville, which was an separate incorporated town, 1881 to 1897. The family moved there about 1882 when she was a baby. She was probably 2 years old. And they lived in various places, but mainly on Laurel Avenue, and then at 1317 White Avenue, which was right directly behind the new Carnegie Hoskins, what is today called the Hoskins Library building. They lived at that White Avenue address by far the longest, and a little later we'll look at some slides of Catherine's paintings that were taken at that house. The family fortunes declined in some way. All of the sons went off and went into some sort of business activity. Edwin was the oldest son. He was he was well educated. He was the first paid librarian who had the single title librarian at the University of Tennessee. His portrait's hanging over in the old Hoskins Library. So he was employed by the university. Eleanor painted portraits of a number of people for the university, particularly James D. Hoskins, who was the dean, and there's a big portrait of him painted by Eleanor Wiley in the old library. So there are a lot of family connections with the university. But the university did buy their house that they lived in for many, many years. I think they lived there probably for about 50 years. And it did eventually get demolished. And it was a parking lot. Now there's a little building there, but it was right behind the library, immediately behind the library across the street, across White Avenue. So there's this Fort Sanders part of Catherine's life. I'm pretty sure that she went to the public schools, because there's no record I could find of her attending the Knoxville City Schools, and the new Knoxville High School was just being created about the time she was admitted to UT. UT started to admit women and students in 1893. Catherine was born in 1879, from 1895 to 1897. She attended the University of Tennessee. Don't know that she got a degree, but that really wasn't that necessary for a young woman at that time. I'm sure she took art lessons from Lloyd Branson and probably from Adelia Armstrong, who were two really important Knoxville painters, and probably was really not employed. The family had enough money that she was probably maybe teaching art or doing something very genteel like that. And she finally was able to go home and study art in New York, the Academy, in 1903 to 1905. And that's really what, it's the amazing thing that catapulted her from being a local person with a little art training to being somebody who was exposed to what was going on in the art world at the time. And this thing is on. If it is or not, we'll see. It is. This is a photograph of Catherine. We have a few photographs of her that came with the things that are at the History Center. This is a photograph of her from about the time when she was a student at the university, about 1897. She was a beautiful young woman. There were 10 children, 4 sons and 4 daughters survived. All of the sons married, but only one of the daughters was married. Catherine was, she sort of jumped into this emerging little world of arts in Knoxville in the first decade of the 20th century. She was involved in the Nicholson Art League. She went on to study. And this is a portrait that was made about, this is the one that she liked. This is the one that she used as an illustration of herself. There's a tinted and an untinted version, but she was really beautiful as a young woman. And this is her scrapbook. This is what I thought I would talk about a little bit about today, because really what you can glean about her life, a lot of what you can know a little bit about personally from her comes from her scrapbook. This is lettered by her on the front scrapbook. That is her writing underneath. It was an inexpensive paperback scrapbook with index pages and then lots of pages in the back. The front page of the book has 2 clippings glued in it. One is her admission to the composition class of Howard Pyle, who's a well-known illustrator. And the other is the clipping about the exhibit of a painting in 1913. And this painting is probably not the one that we have today, but it looked sort of like this one, I suspect. It was a painting of 2 young women perched on a high hill with the clouds behind. And I think the one that she exhibited there was a bigger version of this. And Agnes told me that these 2 models were her sisters, May and June. But Agnes said she made them a lot prettier than they really were. But This painting is one that is still here in Knoxville, and it is currently on loan to the governor's residence in Nashville. These pages in the scrapbook sort of give you a sense of her career. I think she was excited when she first got to go to New York. I think she started this scrapbook to tell her experiences in art, in her art, and in the things that interested her in art and culture. And she won the Cook Medal in 1910 at the Appalachian Exposition for the best collection in the exhibit. And this comes right in the next little part of the scrapbook. At the bottom there's, and these were glued in at different times because that's like 1910. And the two things at the bottom are an admission card for her to go attend an exhibit in 1925. So she was still submitting things to be exhibited from the time from at least 1910 to 1925. She was trying to get her work seen. The little clipping on the right-hand side of there is a little note. Her uncle was William Gibbs McAdoo, and he wrote a letter, which is in the notebook, that's a scrapbook, that says that he was really proud of her painting being hung, and he wanted her to know that he had nothing to do with it being selected and hung. He was very important, but it was hung on its own merits. And this painting was the one that was in the Appalachian Exposition, the new story. She mentions in the scrapbook that it was sold not long after it was exhibited. It was in a gallery and sold. So she's very proud of that. She had a painting, it had been exhibited, and it had sold in Washington, D.C. These are some of the pages that follow in there. There are ribbons that she won. She exhibited in various fairs and contests around the South, Nashville, Atlanta, Knoxville. And I think every clipping that had mention of her work, she probably put in this part of the scrapbook. And those are some of her early works. Two of those are from 1911. And this is kind of interesting. This was pretty much in the front of the scrapbook. She received a letter in the early 1920s from a Frenchman who was compiling information about American artists. He was going to exhibits in the Northeast and compiling things to publish in a little magazine in France. And he had written her a letter and asked if he could reproduce some of her work and put it in the magazine. And Catherine was thrilled. So there are two little newspaper clippings about the fact that she got this letter. There was the little magazine is in one library in this country. It's in the New York Public Library. And according to the information I got, nothing was ever published about Catherine. But it was kind of exciting for her at a time when her life was not going so very well. These are some other artists that she liked. Robert Enright was exhibited some things in the exhibits we had here in Knoxville. He was somebody that she would have encountered. And I think those two paintings of Native Americans that he did might have been exhibited here in one of the expositions. But she had a circle of people that she knew. She got to go back and study in New York with Robert Reed and Frank Benson, several really well-known artists, and there were people that she really admired and I think really influenced her work. If you look at their paintings and her paintings, you do see the influence. And this again is in the scrapbook. She loved all aspects of culture. She loved the stage, she loved music, she loved the movies. And this is the page where she starts up, and she has little sections of the scrapbook. This is where she starts talking about the stage. And you have to remember that Knoxville, after Staub's Theater was built in 1872, had a lot of traveling theater that came through Knoxville, traveling stage companies. And so we would have had some of these well-known people, coming to perform in Knoxville in traveling shows. And these are some people that she pulled out that she particularly liked. And that she liked the movies. They were considered lowbrow and not cultured, but in her art section, she has a lot of pages of pictures of movie stars. And there's Rudolph Valentino, who was the heartthrob of the era in the silent movies. Barbara McClung, Calvin McClung, the man whose collection he's had at the library, enjoyed the movies a lot, and she remarked that people kind of looked down on the fact that they went to the movies. That wasn't something cultured people did. This is a photograph she stuck in her scrapbook of a float that she designed for the UT Dairy for a parade. And as best I can tell, it's not a very good, clear picture, but as best I can tell, there's a calf in that cage. There's some women in the back, the horses. One of my staff thinks they were trying to make the horses look like cows, but I'm not I'm not sure. But she did tuck this in the scrapbook and she did keep it, so it was there. And this is the invitation to the White House wedding. As I mentioned that Woodrow Wilson's daughter, Eleanor Randolph Wilson, was married to Catherine's uncle, William Gibbs McAdoo Jr. in the White House in May 1914, and Catherine got her own invitation. She was the only member of the family who went to the White House wedding. The other family members didn't go, but she did. It was a very small, very private wedding, just family and close friends. And she has paintings and clippings about the wedding. This actually shows where in the White House the wedding was held. And I think she had that invitation tucked in the very front of the scrapbook. I think she was very proud of William Gibbs McAdoo, and she was very proud of her family connection to him. This is the Appalachian Exposition Catalog, the best catalog. This was the first real art exhibition in Knoxville. And this was a really good catalog that they put together. I wish it had more illustration or more description of the works that were here, because they were borrowing art from Washington, from the American Federation of Artists. It was a program you could borrow well-known, well-established works from well-known, well-established painters, and then they had the local component to add to that. Catherine's painting is the new story, and after seeing the painting that's on loan to KMA now of the tea showers upstairs in the higher ground exhibit, which you should all go look at, the exhibit, I'm pretty well convinced that this was painted up at the Stagecoach Inn, the old antebellum Stagecoach Inn, that the family liked to go to up at the Tennessee state line, right next to Hot Springs, North Carolina. The inn was famous for its food. It had really good cooks, and Catherine's family went there quite a bit. And I think this was painted there. This is the painting that she then sent on in 1912 to be exhibited with the Society of Washington Artists that then got sold. So this painting was quite large, and it's probably floating around out there somewhere. Maybe whoever has it doesn't even know who Catherine Wiley is, but I hope they find out. Catherine went to study art to try to be an illustrator. That was her real hope, and I think her real wish. She came back to Knoxville after her studies in New York, and she was the art department at the university. It was a position where she taught everything related to art, including classes on art history. She taught drawing, and she says that she taught painting also. But her work was done in the College of Home Economics, and I think it was really geared mainly toward a practical application of drawing and design. So she did. During those years, she was from like 1907 to 1917. She did some beautiful drawings to give you a sense of what she could do with ink and paper. And this is one of those. She did the drawings for the yearbook, a lot of them. Most of those are given to the University of Tennessee Special Collections. A handful of those are included in the collection that we have at the History Center. This is one of those. She really had a good sense of composition. She was good with, particularly like that one, the guy with the pipe. She had these sectional introductions to sections of one of the yearbooks that she designed. She did try to get some work published as an illustrator, and the main place that she did that was a little literary magazine in Nashville called the John Trotwood Moore magazine. John Trotwood Moore was a famous figure in Nashville at the time, and this little magazine was a literary magazine. And these two illustrations were done by Catherine for a poem, and her name is barely visible in the bottom, but it's very clear. And there were drawings that she did. She was hoping to move into this kind of work, but living in Knoxville, pretty remote from any place where there was any connection to a market to do this kind of work, it really was not ever going to, I don't think, work unless she could pick up and go to a place where she could maybe work directly with people who were involved in publishing. What I wanted to do next was use these slides, which were taken in 1962 outside of the house on White Avenue. 1962 was one of those times when the family started dividing up Catherine's legacy. She died in 1958, and declared clarify a little bit, her career went from 1907 to 1918. She was an instructor at the University of Tennessee Art. She retired from that for reasons of health. She put that in her application to the Academy in 1925. And from 1918 to 1925, she was basically living at home. She was still painting, but her work was changing pretty dramatically. And she was having mental problems, and we don't really know exactly what those were. But Agnes told me that she and Eleanor had similar personalities, and that Catherine was by far the worst of the two. And I suspect she either had severe depression or was bipolar, just the little I know about her. And of course, they had no idea how to deal with that in that day. And there was great shame attached to anybody in your family being put in a mental hospital. So rather than having her put into Lakeshore, Eastern State, her family had a family conference, and they took her sister June took her to Philadelphia. She lived in the apartment with her two bachelor brothers, Ernest and the other one was there, Robert, for a little while, and then she was admitted to Norristown State Mental Hospital, which had earlier been called Norristown State Lunatic Asylum. It gives you kind of a sense of the pejorative nature of being in a place like this. So these are some slides taken in 1962 with color film. Well, this is a slide from Palette, which is part of the material that was given to us by the family, and a little photograph of Catherine painting. And I'm pretty well convinced now that those photographs of her painting were taken up at the old Allen Stagecoach Inn, because there's a copy of those up at that old house that's still with the family. So I think that I wondered how those came to be taken, and I think that's how it was. These are some examples of some of her drawing and painting. She loved to paint her mother. She painted her mother more than any other person. That's her mother on the left, small painting, and a drawing of her mother on the right, and a drawing of an unknown person, older lady, in the middle. But she was really quite good with sketching. She never really finished some of the details, like the hands, for example, are always just sort of brush strokes. This is the painting that got away. This was probably one of her top 3 paintings. It was still here in Knoxville when the paintings were given to us at the History Center. And we were desperately trying to figure out a way to get the money to do the conservation that was desperately needed. And actually, Agnes Wiley suggested that we consider selling one painting in order to raise some money, get some money, and get the conservation done. So we sold this painting, which is easily one of her top 3. It was probably painted in Gloucester, Massachusetts. A dealer in Washington who got interested in Catherine when the Smithsonian American Art Museum de-accessioned her painting, which is now in Greenville, South Carolina, bought this painting from us and took it to be sold. It's been sold since. It's in a private collection, probably, well, I heard Rhode Island, there's no way to know that, but anyway. And that frame was an enormous frame. It was 3 feet wide and 42 inches and 45 inches long. It was gorgeous. And dirty, it was gorgeous. And this is a painting of an unknown woman and young boy. This is the painting that's now at Greenville, South Carolina. This was a painting that the family gave to the American Art Museum, the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. You can see is that in the corner down there, you can actually see the painting with the yard and the porch behind it. And then this is cropped out, but it was not in great shape. It had an awful lot of buckles in the canvas, but it's a fabulous painting. It's called In the Sunlight, and it's in the Greenville collection. The family was very upset when this painting was de-accessioned by the Smithsonian and was sold at auction, but that's what got Glenn Peck on the search for Catherine's paintings, and in a way it revived her career, her reputation. Retrospective. This is the Willow Pond painting, which is in the Metropolitan Museum. I'd love to see if that someday come down to Knoxville so you get a better look at it. I don't think it's ever been exhibited, but it's in their permanent collection. I don't think they'll be accession. This is one of the paintings. She liked to paint leaves and filtered light, and and she usually just painted anybody who was handy. She did not have models, couldn't afford models. This is a woman on a porch with a lot of dapple light behind her. This is one called In the Arbor, and this is one that she did exhibit a number of times, and later in her life, in the 1920s, when she was kind of trying to pull her life back together. What I think happened to her was she died in 1958. Her father got sick about the time she retired from the university. He was sick for 18 months. He died in June 1919. Then her mother, to whom she was very devoted, got sick in 1925 and died. And in 1926, and her mentor, and I think she was extremely close to Lloyd Branson, who was a Knoxville artist, he died in 1925. And his obituary is in the scrapbook. So I think that's probably what set in motion some of her inabilities to deal with maybe life in the world. This is a painting here at the museum, and there it is outside in the yard on White Avenue, 1962. These two, the one on the left is here at the museum, I think. And the one on the right is lost. It's escaped. We don't know where it went. So the family took some of the paintings as part of an inheritance and divvied some of them up, and some of them were sold. This is her Catherine self-portrait. It's supposed to have been done around 1910, and I think it is absolutely fabulous. It is owned by a great niece who lives in Pennsylvania. And she also has the beads that she's wearing. And this is a painting that was in the yard, photographed in the yard of the White Avenue house. And on the photograph on the other side is Catherine painting this painting. And having seen the photograph up at Del Rio, I'm pretty positive that this painting was actually painted up at the end. And I don't know who the subject was, but she was anybody who would pose, probably, and maybe a relative.
Where is that, Steve? Do you know?
It's that one. I do not know where that one got to. And this one, I hope you all recognize. This is the Hieronymian, which was also called Morning Milk. And this is, I think, one of the top paintings that she ever did. It was when we had the exhibit here in 1990, the first real effort to do a retrospective exhibit of Catherine's work, spearheaded by the Tennessee State Museum, the opening exhibit here in the KMA. And at that time, this painting was already owned by Countrywide Financial, so we never thought that it would ever be for sale, but when it was, we were able to partner the Clun Collection and KMA together and buy this and bring it home, and I think it is one of her best paintings. I think it might be Octave Latore. He was the dirt farmer, as one of the family put it, that June married, who lived out in the Carnes area. And they didn't quite approve of the marriage, I get a strong feeling, but Catherine really liked Octave in June. And she wrote little cards that we'll see a few of later. This is a fabulous piece. This is another, these are just the slides from '62. This is another painting. I have no idea where that one got to. Or this one, which I think is really quite good. Indian Woman Wolf Creek is in the collection that we have. This was a Cherokee woman named Dicey, and this was painted up at in Del Rio, up there at the old Stagecoach Inn. The wall behind her looks like a stucco, but it's actually just, it was a kitchen house on the old inn, and the basket that's in the painting is still up there with the family who still live up there. She wanted to be an illustrator. This is Water Babies. I think it's a charming little picture. And now the sad part. In 1926, Catherine was committed to this mental hospital at Norristown, Pennsylvania. Her brothers and sisters were trying to do something to help her, and I guess they did the best that they could. The two color cards at the top show the facility, and the two photographs at the bottom show one of the infirmary and one of the wings. There were separate wings for men and women, and when I was reading a little bit about the hospital, they described some of the patients as criminally insane. I'm not quite sure how to interpret all that. But in the time that Catherine was there, a more enlightened man became the director of the hospital in the 1930s. He was very famous, and he brought in hydrotherapy, cold water, electroshock, and lobotomy. Catherine did not have lobotomy. I don't know if she was ever subjected to any of those things, but it gives you a sense. This was a 225-acre facility, big brick buildings built in the 1870s, early 1900s, with an 8-foot wall, iron fence around the entire place. So it was not a place where you exactly feel, you would feel like a prison there, I think, no matter what you thought. And while Catherine was there, she stayed in touch with the family. One of the things she did was she made these cards. We exhibited a few of these cards here before. All of the ones that we have were sent to June, her sister, Mary Victoria Wiley, who married Octave Latore, who was a farmer whose family came from Louisiana. And that just did not fit in with the social image of the Wiley family at all. But I think June must have been pretty good, pretty cool. And these are some of the cards that she saved. She sent birthday cards, and she always has peace, love, and peace, love, and joy, I think, in every card somewhere. And she was making these out of whatever she could find. She was, little bits of, whatever. And these were glued in a scrapbook, and I guess we should have a conservator try to attach the cardboard that's stuck to them, but I think they're interesting because they show how creative she was at the time, and she had absolutely no access to materials to do anything with.
They're heartbreaking.
What did she paint them with then? What did she?
Whatever she could get. She was getting foil, colored paper, colored pencils, just whatever little things that she could cobble together. And she wrote a long letter on this one, which is really sad. I'm not going to read it, but really, this was what she did from 1927 to 1958, I guess.
It doesn't seem like something a terribly ill, crazy person would do. And she was very normal and
and she wasn't terribly ill. That's the thing about it. The letter she wrote in 1946 is perfectly coherent, and she went out for day trips. Which is why I'm pretty sure they didn't do anything too horrible to her, but they kept her in this facility for all of those years. And she had a great love of music, movies, but she probably had no access to anything at all. She was there. Maybe a radio later. But these are some of the things that she did. And they're very creative. I mean, she had no access to, materials. And so some of these look like they were painted with, it looks like colored pencils and tempera, and some of it even looks like it might have been lipstick. Bits of shades of things. I mean, anything she could put together.
Is there any evidence that she asked for oils or to be able to paint?
They had occasionally a group would bring in a visiting person to entertain the inmates or whatever, and she wrote in the letter in 1946 that a women's club had brought in somebody to do a demonstration of drawing, and she had gotten some drawing paper and she was actually sketching, which is also very sad. This was the first exhibit that really looked back at Catherine. She died in 1958. This is 1964. And the Dillon Gallery of Art pulled together 44 paintings and did an exhibit. And it really did. You have to remember, she had been kind of a non-person for 30 years. She disappeared. And so this was really something to bring her creativity back to the public mind here. And it really did help. And I have always wondered, and I always did suspect maybe that Eleanor was jealous of Catherine. She should have been. Eleanor had some talent, but she was not as good as Catherine, and she recognized that. And she was the one that fought to keep the 44 paintings together that are at the museum.
How old was Catherine when she was committed?
She was 49. Yeah.
Did she try and get out, or did she fight it?
She asked to come home, and she never got to come home.
They didn't want her to.
They did write her, and they did see her a few times, but they really didn't want her back because it would be an embarrassment. And the MMA worked in the Treasury's office at the University of Tennessee for 30 years. I mean, they all had their little place in Knoxville society, and they didn't know what to do with it. It's really sad. But she did a lot in a fairly short time. I think there are a lot more paintings out there that we probably don't know about, that are floating around, and I hope somehow they get back. But Eleanor was the one who was determined that some paintings would stay together. And she wrote a will at 73. Eleanor lived to be 101 years old. She wrote a will at 73, and they could not dispose of this last group of paintings that she put together until she made up her mind. She talked to UT, she talked to, nobody wanted this much stuff. There are 37 paintings. Some of them are not, museum quality. There were drawings. There was a palette, the easel, the chair she sat in, all these little things. And most people didn't want all that. So when the History Center was just started, they said, we'll take it. So that's how they did it there. And this is the catalog of 1990. That woman was one of the few models that Catherine did pay. She was in this painting, and she's in the one with the irises. She was probably a university person. That's where Catherine lived her life. But she liked her coloring, and so she painted a couple of times. And that painting was recently sold. It went through